Mr. Trichet, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's now time to start this event today. And on behalf of the Dean, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, and also on behalf of the Director of the EU Center, Dr. Yeo Lewi, I would like to welcome Mr. Trichet, and I'm extremely honored to have a chance and the opportunity to welcome Mr. Trichet at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It's indeed a great privilege to have with us today a key player of the Eurozone. As you know, Mr. Trichet is the former president of the European Central Bank, and the task of the ECB is to define and to implement the monetary policy for the Eurozone. So we can hardly find a more knowledgeable expert in that topic. The European Union, and particularly the Euro area, has been going through serious difficulties since 2008, when the financial crisis started in the United States of America with the subprime crisis. This was the worst crisis since World War II, and it then developed into a banking and sovereign debt crisis in Europe. What many now call the Euro crisis has also highlighted some structural shortcomings and weaknesses in the setup of the common currency. And the difficulties faced by the euro have been and remain very high on the economic and political agenda, including here in Asia. The euro, one of the strongest symbols of the European Union, became a symbol of crisis. But since then, the EU has put its house into order and its act together. Europe took unprecedented measures to strengthen the common currency, from the European Banking Union to the European Stability Mechanism, or to the program of purchasing bonds, better known as quantitative easing. Those measures were very bold and unprecedented in the history of the European Union, but I'm sure Mr. Trichet will explain much more than I can do about those different measures taken by the EU. In Asia, very unfortunately, and more often than not, the EU appears in the press only when it is in trouble or to report problems, and very often with negative views on its achievements and future. The EU is still very little known, and that's why I'm very pleased to see so many people here tonight to listen to Mr. Trichet. And it's mostly seen through the prism of a certain press that sees the EU as a single market, rather than the political project that its founding fathers always had in mind. But contrary to what some analysts and media and commentators said or would like to see, the EU is highly resilient and its achievements are remarkable. Mr. Trichet has a prestigious career, and it will be way too long to review it in detail now. As I said before, he was from 2003 to 2011 the president of the European Central Bank. This is exactly at the peak of the crisis. Previous to that position, he was the governor of the Banque de France from 1993 to 2003. In 2012, Mr. Jean-Claude Trichet was appointed chairman of the board of directors of the Bruegel Institute, a European think tank dedicated to policy research on international economics, and named after a great European painter of the 16th century. He's also the chairman of the Group of 30 and a member of the Institut de France. Mr. Trichet will speak for about 30 minutes about the Eurozone and share with us his ideas on how to improve economic governance. His presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. And I hope all of you will have many questions to ask to our expert tonight. Mr. Trichet, yesterday you gave a brilliant lecture to the business community at the event organized by the European Chamber of Commerce. The public tonight is different, probably more diverse than last night, but certainly very well aware and concerned about public policies and public management. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Trichet to address this event. Mr. Trichet, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation. It is a pleasure to be here, and I have to say it's also particularly moving because of the name of the place where I am, Lee Kuan Yew. I had the privilege myself to have several encounters with the founding father of this state city in different positions, as governor of Banque de France and as president of the ECB, and it is again a man. He was a man of extreme vision and lucidity. So I will explain what I think are the main weaknesses that we have identified in the euro area governance. And when I say governance, I would implicitly mention the fiscal and economic governance in general of the euro area. I'll try to explain why we, as you said just a moment ago, Mr. Professor, why we have introduced and how we have introduced reforms that are of a great importance, and perhaps what we can say about the future, the immediate future, the conjuncture of the European economy, perhaps the political situation a little bit, and of course the long-term future of this historical endeavor, which is the European construction, the deepening of European unity, which has been decided a long time ago. So, first, a few words on the overall, I would say, period that we are experiencing. As you just said, we have sadly to cope with the most dramatic financial crisis since World War II. My theory is that it could have been the most dramatic financial crisis since World War I, had central banks and governments not taken extremely bold and swift decisions in oversimplifying, and of course I'm open to all questions. One could say that you had three episodes in the financial crisis that we are experiencing. First episode, the financial turbulences from August 2007 to the 15th of September 2008. Subprime, the subprime are triggering general reassessment of risk premia in the markets, all segments of markets of the advanced economy. I insist, it is a financial crisis of the advanced economy. That's the characteristics of this period. And this general reassessment of risk drove the financial markets to reappreciate risk premia, reappreciate spreads, reappreciate volatility. It was a general correction of a previous situation where benign neglect had been generalized and where risks were underassessed by all market participants, all institutions, investors and savers the world over, and particularly in the advanced economy. First episode, financial turbulences. Second episode, I would say after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, grave and immediate threat of collapse of the financial system in the advanced economy. This a single event, the bankruptcy of a medium-sized investment bank in one particular marketplace, Lehman Brothers in New York, triggered an absolutely dramatic phenomenon of contagion in all, I would say, advanced economy, as regards all markets, all segments of markets, all institutions. The counterparty risks were reappreciated dramatically, and I would say practically overnight. That second episode of the crisis, this grave and immediate threat of collapse of the financial system, created, very fortunately, only, if I may, a big recession, and not the big depression that we would probably have had the central banks not taken immediate decisions, bold and immediate decisions, and had the governments themselves not taken also very bold decisions implying the taxpayer risk in all advanced economies. That second period lasted from the 15th of September 2008 up to end of 2009. And then what I would call a crisis of the financial private signature was morphed into a crisis of the public signature, a crisis of the overall sovereign risk. For a number of reasons, and I could explain these reasons in the question and answer session. But clearly, at that moment, the epicenter of the crisis, which was in the United States of America, the subprime crisis, the Lehman Brothers collapse, coming after the difficulties of Bear Stearns, the difficulty of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and the difficulty immediately after Lehman Brothers of AIG. Again, the very same phenomenon appeared in the euro area, with the difficulty of Greece, the difficulty of Ireland, the difficulty of Portugal, the difficulty of Spain, and you name it. And it was, again, a phenomenon where the global investors and savers expressed absence of confidence in a number of signatures that were, I would say, in my own understanding of what was happening in a system. It was the system itself that was considered weak, and Wall Street was considered very weak at a certain moment, say, to oversimplify, in 2008, September 2008, and then we had a number of signatures in the euro area which were considered extremely weak, and with all the consequences in terms of combination of the, I would say, long part of the market trying to avoid to lose money, and the speculative part of the market trying to make money out of the situation. So the question, the real question, and particularly the question for your own institution concentrating on governance and public governance, is what were exactly the reasons why the epicenter of the crisis in its third episode was in the euro area. After all, we could have had the most vulnerable signature in the sovereign risk constituency, which could have been out of the euro area. Another one would have been, I don't know, in Asia. A third one would have been in another part of Europe. But why that concentration on the euro area? Which is particularly paradoxical in a way, because the euro area on a consolidated basis is more solid than most of the advanced economy were in terms of yearly deficit, in terms of outstanding debt as a proportion of GDP, in terms of public debt as a proportion of GDP, in terms of current account The current account of the euro area as a whole was balanced, not the current account of the US or of the UK. The yearly deficit consolidated in the euro area was better than many, including Japan, including US, and the debt outstanding was a little bit better also than it was the case, of course, in the US, and much, much better than it was the case in Japan. So all taken into account, paradox. But it is clear that within this system of the euro area, which as on a consolidated basis appeared to be reasonably well managed, you had, again, as a paradox, the worst signature in the advanced economy and the best signature in the advanced economy. And it was the average, which was a little bit better, perhaps, than the other advanced economy. But that average was made of the best and the worst. And so the question is, why is it that some of the worst signature were precisely in the euro area? I will suggest, and again, consider, because time is limited, and I try to stick to the limited period of time I was given generously, I would consider that these are titles of chapters, and then, of course, I would be delighted to embark on more explanation in the question and answer session. I see 6 reasons why we were the epicenter in the 3rd episode of the financial crisis. The first reason is that we did not respect our own framework of the Stability and Growth Pact. We were running a single currency. We had no federal budget, no federal political federation, achieved political federation. We are a strange animal in Europe. There are elements of federation in Europe, and I could go back to that. But we are not a full-fledged political federation, of course, and we have no federal budget of great, I would say, significant dimension. And that, of course, calls, if you run a single currency, for a framework, a fiscal framework, the Stability and Growth Pact, which was our rule, which we negotiated when we decided to embark on this historical endeavor. And in this respect, our problem is absolutely clearly that we did not respect it. I don't want to elaborate too much on that, but when I was appointed myself president of the ECB, I had to cope with a revolt of the big countries under the chair of Italy. Germany and France decided that the Stability and Growth Pact would not apply to them. And of course, that created a real problem. My first speech in front of the European Parliament was to defend the Stability and Growth Pact and explain that in a single currency area, without a federal budget, you had to respect a framework. So that's the first reason why we had countries that appeared particularly vulnerable, because the system was not respected and some were vagabonding out of the norm which had been decided upon before we created the Maastricht concept. Second reason, we had no monitoring of the deviation of relative competitiveness from the average. I would say, to oversimplify for the economists that are here, that that single currency area was a nominal single currency area, and it was important to care for it to remain close to a real single currency area, so that the unit labor cost would not vagabond upward or downward, creating tensions inside the single currency area, inside the single market with a single currency. I have to recognize that we had no governance ex ante for this particular issue, because there was a belief, ex post, clearly a very naive belief, that market economy would care for that. That, you know, if any particular economy would lose competitiveness, the spontaneous reaction of the social partners, of the entrepreneurs, of all, I would say, the social fabric and political fabric of the society would care for going back to appropriate competitiveness, to the extent that without appropriate competitiveness, you are losing the capacity to produce growth and to create jobs. But the fact is that it was not the way it functioned. And I have to say that as soon, maybe it could have been sooner, but as soon as 2005, I myself and my colleagues in the ECB strongly believed that it was our main problem, apart from the absence of meeting the requirement of the Stability and Growth Pact. A major problem for us was the deviation from the appropriate average of the euro area of the relative competitiveness. And I circulated myself to all ministers of finance of the euro area every month since 2005 the unit labor cost evolutions, the current account surpluses or deficits, and some were very large deficits, and also the number of other indicators showing that the nominal evolutions of some indicators were not at all convergent, including the wages and salaries in the public service, in the civil service, which of course was a good criteria for me to tell the ministers of finance, look, you're responsible for that particular indicator because these are decisions taken by ministers of finance, and look, you are deviating a lot. I'll need to give you 2 or 3 figures. From the setting up of the euro 1st January 1999 up to the start of the sovereign risk crisis, end of 2009. In some countries, the wages and salaries increases in the civil service were plus 117%. In the worst country, if I may. In another country, it was 110%, plus 110%. At the level of the average of the euro area, it was 36% over that period. And for the country that augmented its wages and salaries in the civil service the least, it was 20%. So from 20 to 117 in the same single market with the same single currency area, demonstrating that as I said, the competitive channel was not functioning correctly, that there was no spontaneous correction in those economies and society that you would have expected when the situation was aggravated by the euro. And that is something which I consider really a second reason, a second major reason for the to respond to the question, why were you at the epicenter of the crisis? Third reason, absence of banking union, which played an important role in the stretching of the euro area between the good signature and the bad signature, because the correlation between the creditworthiness of the banks and the creditworthiness of the countries, of the state, was very high, and even made higher in the time of the crisis. For obvious reasons, when you are a particular financial institutions in a particular country, of course your risks are on this country. You are lending to the households and corporate in this country, and you also own, you have a bias, a home bias, you own treasuries of that particular country. So you have, of course, a high level of correlation. But on top of that, the crisis created an even higher level of correlation, because the backstop at the moment where all the financial institutions were about to collapse was the state, precisely. And so for the external investors and savers, the creditworthiness of that particular institution was backed by the creditworthiness of that particular state in which this institution was placed. And so, for obvious reasons, if the state was creditworthy, then the backstop was creditworthy, and then your counterparty risk was considered much, of course, reliable. So that's one of the reasons why you said very wisely, Mr. Professor, in your introduction, the crisis of the sovereign and of the banks. There had been a first crisis of the banks in, say, in 2008, which was generalized, US, Japan, UK, Europe. But when in Europe you had the start of the sovereign risk crisis, then it hit for the second time the banks for the reason I am just mentioning. And the vicious circle of bad signature of the banks, bad signature of the state, and all the interaction between these bad signature was offset by a virtuous circle, good signature of bank, good signature of states. And that, of course, stretched even more the euro area between what I was qualifying bad signature and good signature. Then you had a fourth reason. This was the third reason. You have a fourth reason, which is the absence of ex-ante tool to counter a dramatic situation like the situation we had to cope with. In the United States of America, there was not much ex-ante tools of that kind, but you could create it. The TARP, for instance, with one decision-making process. Even if it were difficult, you might remember that the rejection by the overall Congress was the first reaction of the political decision-making process in the US. But very soon, the executive branch convinced the political leadership that it was necessary indeed, and that, as I said, the system was collapsing, and that the House of Cards was about to totally collapse. And then the Congress voted the TARP. In Europe, you had to go through 15 decision-making process, because, again, we are not an achieved political federation, so you had to care for a very large number of decision-makers. And it was, of course, much more laborious, much more difficult an experience than in if we had political federation. This is the fourth reason why we were the epicenter. There are two others which are not specific to the euro area countries. By the way, 15 at the moment of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, but which are the issues that are discussed, decided upon, at the level of the 28 members of the European Union. And that is the absence of full implementation of the overall single market, and the absence of appropriate implementation of the reform, the structural reforms, the so-called Lisbon agenda in Europe, or the 2020 agenda now. In both cases, it is, as I said, goal of the 28, of the full European Union. It is a very important goal, but of course it's even more important for the single market with a single currency area, because when you are in such a situation, you need an economy which would be as flexible as possible, as I would say supple as possible when you have to adjust, and both from that standpoint, the achievement of the full achievement of the single market and the appropriate implementation of structural reforms are of the essence, of course. One of the paradoxes being that, paradoxically again, the countries that are in the euro area frequently are more reserved vis-à-vis the implementation of the single market and of the structural reform than the countries that are out of the euro area, which is again a paradox of the situation, because they need more. But okay, that's the way we have to look at the reality as it is. So, you see, there were a number of reasons why we were in that situation and stretched between bad signature and good signature. What have we done in those circumstances? I think quite a lot, obviously. The Stability and Growth Pact has been reinforced with new decisions, important reversal of the burden of the proof. If you want not to be applied by the rule, then you have to get a qualified majority against the position of the Commission. We have a new treaty which was called the Fiscal Compact and which is introducing in national legislation elements of I would say, implementation of the Stability and Growth Pact that are additional to what was foreseen before the crisis. You have the so-called European semester, which is also a manner to give the Commission more clout to monitor what's going on in the various countries. So decisions were taken, and they undoubtedly are important, including a new treaty. On the second reason, namely the absence of monitoring of relative competitiveness and imbalances, excessive imbalances, we have a new pillar for governance, which is a pillar for economic governance, which is called the MIP, the Macroeconomic Imbalance Procedure. If I have a message, you should retain that MIP is as important as SGP, the Macroeconomic Imbalance Procedure, as important as the Stability and Growth Pact in terms of maintaining and preserving the cohesion of the euro area, avoiding that some countries would be put in a situation like before the start of the crisis, with very poor level of competitiveness, very high level of current account deficits, and a particular level of vulnerability that would be a cause for major problems for themselves and for the whole of the euro area. So first I would say weakness, a correction. Second weakness, a correction. Third weakness, absence of banking union. Now we have a banking union, which is also in the making, but which call for extremely bold decisions to centralize at the level of the ECB, the surveillance, banking surveillance for the euro area as a whole, is a major decision, one of the most important since the single currency was decided. And as you might know, we have created a European Stability Mechanism, ESM, which is also called for a treaty. So the absence of tools has been also corrected. And there has been a reaffirmation that, of course, the achievement of the single market and the necessity of structural reforms were, I would say, the consensus of all countries, the 15 as well as the 28. All taken into account, these are important decisions that were taken in the crisis in a very difficult period. As you know, Jean Monnet used to say, it is in the crisis that you can really take the tough decisions that are necessary. I note en passant that when everybody was saying it's impossible to imagine politically to have a new treaty, before the crisis it was common belief. In the crisis we had two new treaties. And as bizarrely as it might, it was going through all the decision-making processes that I have mentioned, and this is something which certainly is telling on our societies, what they do when the necessity is clearly there. So a lot of things were being done. A lot of weaknesses, and that, of course, is on the bad side, if I may, of the situation. The clumsy position of Europe having the epicenter of the third episode of the crisis. Now decisions have been taken that are on a better side, if I may, of the balance. Of course, one has to stress that all these new decisions, new, I would say, reform, have to be fully implemented, including, of course, the MIP, which I insisted is very important, including the banking union, and that we probably have to go further. We cannot say that Europe and the euro area is now at a steady state. I really trust that we have to go further, and we could imagine several ways to go further. There are, and it's only, again, titles of chapter. We certainly could progressively grow the start of a significant federal budget. For the present moment, it's very meager, as you know, but of course, we could grow that budget. It calls for transferring at the level of the center more responsibility. And we will see what happens. The Europeans are really in a position where they are making history. If they decide to have a defense, which would be a common defense, I mentioned that because it is one of the proposals which is backed by the European people. They consider that it would not be bad to have a joint defense at the level of Europe. And this, when I say that, I'm speaking of the 28, not only of the 15. And that is, of course, something which automatically would grow the budget. You could imagine other ways of transferring at the center part, for instance, of the overall social protection. All this is delicate, all this calls for very difficult decision. It is not easy. And I really think that when we reflect on that, we have to see that it also calls for expanding, of course, politically, the sphere of what is already in Europe quasi-federal. And if I may, only to remind you where we can say that we have a quasi-federation, it is certainly the case in the international trade negotiation, where we have a single negotiator, which is Europe as a whole, 28. We certainly have that also when we deal with the competition issues, where there are single decisions that are taken at the level of Europe as a whole, and also taking into account the place of Europe at the global level, exactly like is the case in the United States of America. We have, of course, a quasi-federation as regards the currency. And when I should say a full-fledged federation in the domain of the currency. Monetary policy is decided by a single entity and which can decide for enormous amount of I would say, heavy decision in a few hours. So this is federation. And you have elements of federation that are also not negligible. A court of justice, which is creating jurisprudence for the entire Europe, which is something which, some kind of constitutional court at the level of Europe, which is something which is currently neglected, but seems to me important also. And you have the embryo of a Congress with a parliament which is elected by universal suffrage. And that, of course, also is something which is important. So I mention all that because we are a hybrid entity. We are not a full-fledged federation, but we have elements of federation that are there. But that's one way, say, you grow more the federal aspect of Europe. You're more of a political federation. You have more of a federal budget, and this, of course, goes in the direction. So you can imagine to go along this line. You have another way, which I think is not negligible, even if it is very original, and to my knowledge, I'm the only one making a plea for such a solution. I say that as regards the fiscal and economic governance of Europe, we have reinforced this fiscal and economic governance and financial governance considerably, to the extent that the recommendations that are made at the level of the center, namely by the Commission and the Council, namely by the administration of Europe and by the governments of Europe, are not followed, not accepted by one particular country. You know that in the present system, the weaponry that exists are fines. So country X doesn't want to apply by the rule, okay, we impose a fine. And that was, you know, considered very appropriate when the negotiation took place. We were in a world where we could not imagine that some behavior would be very bad, that terrible crisis would erupt here and there, and it was considered an appropriate deterrent to threaten a particular country to have a fine. The fact is that we were placed in a situation where a lot of countries were asking on the country to be helped. So if a country which has to be helped has a fine, it doesn't help in any respect, and the country does not consider that it is really a deterrent to behave better. The country would say probably, well, you're very kind, you're giving me a fine, could you finance yourself the fine, because you know I'm broke. And that is a situation that we know. So what I imagine, and I draw your attention to the fact that, of course, it's something which is quite bold, obviously, but I imagine that instead of embarking at the center on these negotiations of, not negotiation, decisions to impose fines, I imagine that the country which doesn't want to apply the recommendations which are made by the center would say, I am in disagreement. I ask for the arbitrage of the European Parliament in the format of the euro area. So all the MPs representing the people of the euro area would have to say if the governments, the Council and the Commission are right on the one hand, or if the country which is opposing the recommendation is right. It seems to me that it would be better than the present system. Better because, first, it would be democratic. It's not, you know, an administration or an entity which is complex like the Commission and the other governments that are deciding upon you. These are the representative of the people. So it's fully democratic. You cannot dispute the legitimacy of these MPs, even if today the reputation of the European Parliament is not fantastic. But nevertheless, they are elected by universal suffrage. Second, it would be operational, because my idea is that the decision taken by the Parliament would be immediately to be implemented in the country. It would, of course, it calls for a new treaty, a new possibility of having this kind of democratic decision. And it would respect, which is important in the European context, the principle of subsidiarity, because you would apply that only in exceptional cases. Not, you know, on a regular basis, the center imposing their policies to all. No, only in those exceptional cases where you have a country which is in a very, or threatening to be in a very dramatic situation, and where you would say, okay, we have one problem, let's take that particular problem. It's an exceptional case. It's not, absolutely not the rule. It's exactly this idea. Europe does what is, can be done only at the level of Europe, and all the rest has to be done at the level of the countries themselves. The Europeans are very attached to the subsidiarity principle, And it seems to me that to imagine a jump in Europe towards a full-fledged federation as simply as that is not very credible. To say in some exceptional cases we could activate a decision-making process which would obviously be some kind of federation seems to me more, I would say, palatable, thinkable. And I call that the activation of an economic and fiscal federation by exception. So I don't say anything else on that. And again, I draw your attention to the fact that it is one idea amongst many others, and that I give that as an illustration of the fact that the Europeans are making history. They will not copy the United States of America, they will not copy Switzerland, they will not copy any model that exists. They have to invent something, as they did until now, because again, as I said, we are some kind of hybrid entity with many, many characteristics. So I had several other points, but I see that now I am over and above the time you gave me. So maybe I will take advantage of the question to make my points on the present situation of Europe at the moment I'm speaking, on the conjuncture in Europe, perhaps on the political problems that are emerging in advanced economies in general and also in Europe as regards the extremist quote-unquote groups, and of course any other question that you would like to ask. And it was a great pleasure to embark on this introductory exposition. Thank you very much for your attention.